I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the motorcycle industry is at a turning point. Heck, the automotive industry as a whole is at a turning point. As sales are in steep decline, the long-term future of this two-wheeled hobby could be in jeopardy. The question of what's next for motorcycle manufacturers is quite different than for cars. It's less about automation and EV technology. It's actually more rooted in the opposite, something human and analog and emotionally driven. While on the car side, the automotive industry is focused on convenience and everything being digital and software driven, those motorcycle manufacturers that are making bikes that give riders a pure mechanical experience and often on simple, smaller displacement motorcycles versus high-tech, high-performance ones, these are the companies that are succeeding and growing. One such manufacturer stands poised to offer that experience in an affordable and quality package unlike anything we've ever seen before, aside from maybe the Japanese takeover in the 60s and 70s, and that company is CFMoto. The history of Chinese motorcycles is pretty fascinating and honestly not talked about enough. On one level, it started out sort of mirroring that of the Japanese motorcycle manufacturers, with the need for economic transportation in the mid-20th century really being the catalyst for growth in the two-wheeled segment. But as Japanese manufacturers would reach global appeal in a really short period of time, Chinese manufacturers didn't have the same kind of success. At this point, China wasn't taking part in global trade. They didn't function as a free market set up for competition, and so manufacturers often resorted to copying existing designs and producing motorcycles in pretty rudimentary factory setups. They just weren't in a place to really grow beyond their own market, but all of this would change in the 80s and 90s with economic reforms that essentially opened up China's economy, setting the stage for manufacturers like CFMoto to bring on investments for R&D and for more sophisticated modern manufacturing. The Chinese government began investing heavily into automotive manufacturing. They subsidized research and they gave low-interest loans to manufacturers. Motorcycle production exploded at this point. By the early 2000s, China was the world's largest producer and exporter of motorcycles, typically producing, low-cost models under contract for global markets or, selling directly under their own brands. Now, while most of these companies focused on low-displacement, mass-market bikes, CFMoto took a different approach. It focused on higher displacement, sportier, and more premium offerings. This was so genius because it really did carve out a space that would help CFMoto compete in global markets down the road. The company was also more brand forward and ambitious in design and in technology partnerships. Still, they faced massive hurdles if they were going to compete with the Japanese and European manufacturers who had been making reliable, high-quality, performance-oriented bikes for the Western market for decades. Despite their growth in the East, the stigma surrounding Chinese motorcycles in the West seemed virtually impossible to overcome. Chinese bikes were, and in many places still are, thought to be cheaply made, unreliable, and just unappealing machines. In Crankit's amazing video on this topic, which I do highly recommend, he points out that a major reason for this stigma is something known as the 13-year rule. In essence, in the early 2000s, China introduced a policy that all motorcycles must be deregistered and scrapped once they reached their 13th birthday. The idea behind this was that older motorcycles would cause more pollution. It's silly, and thankfully they don't really enforce it much anymore. Now, the problem with this is that it doesn't incentivize manufacturers to make long-lasting, reliable, quality machines, and this is one reason that Chinese bikes have long had a reputation for being cheap with, more of a focus on quantity over quality. They're seen as sort of disposable machines, and rightly so, many of them have been. At the same time, though, this 13-year rule actually pushed Chinese manufacturers to look abroad for their sales, and it's in this environment that CFMoto began thinking critically about how they could become a global player by making a different kind of product than the other Chinese manufacturers. Founded in 1989 in Hangzhou, Zhejiang province, CFMoto, short for Shengfeng Motor Group, initially focused on the production of motorcycle engines and small displacement scooters. Like many Chinese manufacturers at this time, the company's early growth was all about making affordable transportation for their home market. Still, CFMoto began standing out in these early years by investing heavily in R&D. The early development of liquid-cooled engines all the way back at the turn of the century really showed what their ambitions were. By the early 2000s, CFMoto had begun producing its own motorcycles, ATVs, and side-by-sides. What really set CFMoto apart from other Chinese companies, beyond just engineering and capability, or also low pricing, was their clear vision for international growth. Starting in the mid-2000s, the company began laying the groundwork for a global strategy, making several key moves that would distinguish them from most of their domestic competitors. Unlike many early Chinese motorcycle manufacturers who focused mostly on volume, CFMoto made a commitment to improving quality, and they began doing so at a time when Chinese motorcycles had this global reputation for being cheap crap. In many ways, there wouldn't be the recent shift in perception towards Chinese motorcycle brands without CFMoto. They built their own state-of-the-art R&D center in Hangzhou, and they began benchmarking their products against Japanese and European models. Their decision to develop larger displacement motorcycles, the 650 NK and 650 GT, this really showed their intent to compete with the major brands in the mid-size segment, and these bikes have really put the other major manufacturers on notice because of how they've been priced and how they compete in terms of specs. CFMoto began building a strong international dealer network, especially in places like Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe, Latin America, Australia, while gradually moving also into Western Europe and North America. By targeting many of the underserved regions first, they avoided a lot of the direct competition with industry giants, and they were able to build their credibility and also build revenue. Now, if there was one strategic move that really set CFMoto apart from the sea of other Chinese manufacturers, it's the company's long-term partnership with Austrian motorcycle giant KTM. This alliance didn't just elevate CFMoto's technical standards, it really altered how the global motorcycle industry perceived Chinese brands. It's difficult to overstate what this partnership gave CFMoto: brand legitimacy, access to technology, and also a product pipeline that it needed to compete with the best. This partnership started back in 2011 when KTM entered into a distribution and component manufacturing agreement with CFMoto. At the time, KTM was looking for a foothold into the Chinese market, while CFMoto wanted more of that technological legitimacy and manufacturing know-how. So initially, CFMoto assembled KTM motorcycles for domestic Chinese sale, and they would manufacture certain components under license. This early stage was really critical. While most Chinese manufacturers were still focused on reverse engineering Japanese bikes or competing on price alone, CFMoto was already working with one of Europe's best, most performance-oriented motorcycle brands. The company gained immediate insight into European standards of design and safety and emissions compliance. All of these are hurdles, for Chinese manufacturers that are trying to enter Western markets. The real turning point came in 2014 when the two companies formed a formal joint venture called KTM R2R, headquartered in Hangzhou. Now, this wasn't just a contract deal, it was a joint commitment to shared manufacturing, R&D, and market development. CFMoto began producing entire KTM models, including the Duke 200, 250, and later the 790 Duke, not just for domestic sale, but also for export back to Europe and other markets. And so this kind of reverse flow of manufacturing from China to Europe really was a massive shift. It placed CFMoto in a category separate from other Chinese manufacturers who were still mostly locked out of developed markets. And now CFMoto wasn't just producing their own models, it was producing legitimately high-end European motorcycles under KTM's oversight. By 2017, they were manufacturing the KTM LC8C parallel twin platform, which powered models like the 790 Duke and later the 790 Adventure. These engines formed the basis for CFMoto's own higher-end offerings, bikes like the 800 MT adventure bike and the 800 NK naked sport bike. And what they were able to do was blend this European engineering with Chinese cost advantages. Now, this wasn't a one-sided deal. KTM benefited massively. They gained access to China's vast consumer market. They got cost-effective, high-volume manufacturing, support for meeting regulatory requirements in China, where there are, quite a few hurdles for foreign manufacturers. Meanwhile, CFMoto gained cutting-edge engine technology and manufacturing processes, and also access to KTM's design and development pipeline, and just credibility, something that most Chinese brands have spent decades struggling to get and still don't have. What makes this partnership even more more critical is that it's not just about licensing or contract production. CFMoto and KTM now co-develop motorcycles with shared R&D and even design overlap. The 800 MT is a great example. It's not just a clone of a KTM 790 Adventure. It is a reinterpretation of this platform built with CFMoto's own frame geometry, electronics, and styling. CFMoto is not really dependent on KTM at this point, but rather they use KTM and this collaboration as kind of a springboard to innovate on their own terms. And with the way that everything is going, one has to wonder if KTM haven't kind of helped to build the monster that could ultimately destroy them. In the end, this partnership has had a massive effect. It dramatically boosted CFMoto's credibility, and it really allowed CFMoto to sell bikes in premium categories that I don't know if it would have ever been able to get into before. And so now CFMoto has begun launching motorcycles that do really stand out from the other Chinese manufacturers because, they actually have somewhat original designs. The 700 CLX, for instance, it's got this kind of retro styling with modern features. The 800 MT is positioned right there in the middleweight adventure bike category, and it looks pretty good, Unlike early Chinese models, which copied Western designs, CFMoto's recent lineup, I don't know, it shows a kind of confidence and originality. The Papillon models made to compete, of course, with the Grom at $100 less MSRP. They're very competitive with the Grom in terms of specs and even with an extra gear. And with this cute little fairing version on the SS, CFMoto's lineup is just getting so diverse from the $8,000 675cc triple sport bike, to large 1000cc ATVs and side-by-sides, which is a category that's often overlooked when discussing motorcycles, but it is a massive chunk of revenue for these companies. CFMoto feels like a real competitor, and for people who've spent a lot of time on these bikes, I don't know if you can really tell that much of a difference between one of these bikes and a KTM or, something out of Japan. Today, CFMoto is sold in over 100 countries with assembly plants, dealerships, and service centers going up all over Europe and Asia and North America. Though they're not quite mainstream here in the US yet, it is moving in that direction. They are gaining traction among new riders and budget-conscious riders. Most of the dealerships around me are scrambling to get these bikes in stock. Everybody I talk to just praises them. And it's this general attitude from real riders who just want a quality bike. And the way they talk about these bikes, it makes me feel like we might be in a similar situation to the 70s when riders started switching over to Japanese bikes over British and American bikes. In 2022, CFMoto jumped into racing with a Moto 2 team and a Moto 3 team. Last year, a young rider named Devin Alonso destroyed everyone in Moto 3 under the CFMoto name. One has to wonder what it would look like for CFMoto to compete in MotoGP. They just unveiled a sort of prototype leader bike. Maybe CFMoto is the company to take on Ducati because right now, the Japanese manufacturers just aren't cutting it. Now, as cool as that would be, it's really the small and middleweight segments that matter, and that's the place where CFMoto has been aggressively targeting their motorcycle development. These are segments previously dominated, of course, by companies like Honda and Kawasaki and Yamaha and even Triumph. I mean, look at the rise of Royal Enfield and also Honda's response with the 350cc GB models. Small to mid-displacement bikes are where it's at right now, even here in the West. But the truth is, many of these companies have kind of been resting on their laurels. CFMoto is injecting a much-needed level of competition. Take the CFMoto 800 MT Touring. This adventure bike is a direct competitor to models like the Yamaha Tracer 9, Suzuki V-Strom 800D, KTM 890 Adventure, and Triumph Tiger 850 Sport, but it comes in at a significantly lower price while still having really impressive performance, features, and reliability. It's $2,000 to $3,000 less than these bikes. It's got a competitive power to weight ratio, but it has more standard features, things like a quick shifter and heated grips. It's fully loaded. You don't have to spend a bunch of extra money to get a bike that's literally ready for everything. And on top of all this, it's a pretty dang good looking adventure bike. Now, the only real disadvantages are things that should probably change if CFMoto keeps growing globally. Parts are less readily available. For sure, there's going to be worse resale value. But for those who just want to get a nice middleweight bike that they can kind of ride the wheels off of, you can see why people are moving towards CFMoto. The CFMoto 450 SS is perhaps the single most compelling sport bike in the entry to mid-level class today, especially when you compare it to similar offerings from Kawasaki and Yamaha and even KTM and Honda. It's the same price as the Ninja 400, as the R3, as the RC390. It's way cheaper than a CBR 500R. It makes more power and torque than pretty much all of these bikes. It's competitive in terms of weight. It beats everyone in terms of suspension and brakes. It has a full TFT with phone connectivity, and it looks pretty sweet. It looks like a proper sport bike. CFMoto knows that if they can succeed in these segments, in these small to mid-displacement segments, then they can succeed anywhere. Now, if you know motorcycle history or you've been around this channel at all, you know that the most significant shift came in the 60s and 70s with the global takeover by the Japanese manufacturers. Now, the way that they did it is what really applies to this story. The British manufacturers were the dominant force in the West, but companies like Honda managed to make better, more reliable, and higher tech motorcycles with more features at a lower price. That's it. They did it by investing heavily into R&D and by investing into vertical integration. Basically, they weren't dependent on anybody else the way that the British companies were. Everything was in-house, so to speak, to use a watch term. One difference to today is the simple fact that reliability isn't probably going to get much better compared to, the way that it was in the 60s. There was lots of room to grow. So I'm not exactly sure how a company like CFMoto is going to make way more reliable motorcycles or have way better performance. But what they can do, like, companies like Honda did, is make the same kinds of bikes with the same or even better tech specs at a way lower price. And that is what CFMoto is trying to do, and that's why they're succeeding. In many ways, CFMoto's moves in the global motorcycle market can be compared to BYD's moves in the car market. BYD consistently offers high-quality cars in every segment at a lower price than competitors. They're capable of making EVs, they make budget economy cars, they make high-end luxury vehicles. They are also vertically integrated and heavily invested in their own R&D. The difference is that CFMoto can operate here in America, whereas BYD can't. And if BYD could, the story would be very much the same. So while a company like CFMoto may not have the heritage of a Honda or the prestige of Ducati, I really believe they're closing the gap, and fast. And for riders around the world, that means more choice, more innovation, more competition, and perhaps the beginning of a true reshuffling of the motorcycle industry's global hierarchy. CFMoto's rise is no accident. It's the result of calculated decisions, persistent innovation, and strategic global partnerships. This company has transformed its image from an emerging market brand to a serious global player that you have to pay attention to. I really think that CFMoto's growth represents a kind of shift in the motorcycle industry, as Japanese and European manufacturers have been focusing so much on premium, high-margin models, often, giant dad bikes. CFMoto, alongside Royal Enfield, though in a very different way, they're stepping into that space that prioritizes value, and in the case of CFMoto, the goal is to do this without compromising modern engineering or design. With bikes like the 450 SS, the 800 MT, they have earned critical acclaim, and the brand's continued investment in R&D and in motorsports now, it isn't so much that CFMoto is just catching up. They're kind of starting to lead. If the current trajectory continues, the company could very well reshape the competitive landscape of motorcycling and possibly take over entirely. And I know this sounds like an exaggeration, but I have had multiple dealerships recently tell me that they believe CFMoto could end up the main motorcycle manufacturer in just 10 years, and that their growth and their overall plan has the potential to be that massive. Now, I would love to hear from you guys because I'm sure many of you either own or have ridden CFMotos, so let us know what you think of the company and what you think the future holds. So we'll see you guys in the next one. Ride safe.